The live stream has been started, and we'll just let people pop in as fast as they can.
Good evening, guys. Welcome. Give us a moment. We're just waiting for some more attendees, and we'll get started here in a second. All right, shall we?
Go ahead, Meena.
Well, good evening. My name is Meena Vindal, and on behalf of the Pakistani-American Collaborative of Texas, I'd like to welcome everybody tonight for a little bit of conversation with some of our state representatives. I myself am a mom of three. I've been an Austinite on and off for 28 years, first as a student at UT, and now as a business owner and a physician here in our community for the last 15 years. It's very easy for me to get distracted, as I'm sure it is for a lot of you, and focus solely on what's happening on our national stage right now, the Senate elections, the presidential race. And I have to remind myself that when it comes to the day-to-day lives of us as citizens here in our state, so much is dependent on really who our state legislators are. If you're a Texan looking for access to health care, you need to know your state representative. If you're a parent and you're worried about the resources that your teachers are going to have as they teach your kids, you need to know your state representative. And if you're worried about safety and inclusion, whether as a minority or on the scope of gun violence, you really need to know who your state representative is. So tonight, we are lucky to have 4 of our state representatives running for re-election with us tonight. John Bucy, Vikki Goodwin, Donna Howard, and Jamse Talarico. We'll begin with some brief introductions, show you what our agenda is. But before we do, from PACT and all of us here, I just want to say to the 4 of you, thank you. Thank you for joining us. We as a community and a group want nothing more than a place at the table. We want to be heard. We want honesty, and more than anything else, we want to serve. We want to serve our community. And by joining us, you give us a chance to have dialogue and do that tonight. So welcome.
Thank you.
So we'll get started. Let's show you our agenda for the evening, some brief introductions, and we'll move into a panel discussion moderated by Farouk, and then some community Q&A. So we have a chance to interact with all of them, moderated by Sana, and then we'll finish up by just telling you a little bit about our future events and close the evening. So let's move on to introductions. So we'll begin with Representative John Bucy. He's up for re-election in District 136, which is sort of Cedar Park, Brushy Creek, Leander, North Austin area. He's completing his first term. He himself has been a business owner, and when he got elected, he was actually given the distinction in the Texas House as Freshman of the Year. His priorities, some of his priorities are healthcare, education, and voting rights. And then on to our next representative who's with us today. That would be Donna Howard, a true veteran serving our state. She's up for re-election for District 48 in the Austin Westlake, extending down South Sunset Valley over to 35. She has been serving us for 14 years, formerly a critical care nurse, has served in the Eaton School Board, and some of her priorities are equal opportunity and women's health. And then we have Vikki Goodwin with us tonight, up for re-election for our District 47. This area would be Bee Cave, Lakeway, Spicewood area. Also a small business owner herself and a realtor in our community. Vikki's known for getting people to come together, and she actually put together an anti-racism advisory group. And her priorities are healthcare, education, and the environment. And last but not least, we have Jamse Talarico, running for re-election in House District 52, Round Rock, Georgetown, Taylor, and Hutto, those areas, completing his first term. When elected, Jamse was the youngest state rep to be elected in 2018, and he's a former public school teacher and really emphasizes education equity and the expansion of healthcare. So with that, we'll dive right into the heart of it and get into a panel discussion led by Farouk.
Thank you, Mina. So my name is Farouk Hassan. I've been in Austin about 20 plus years here, and I work in IT consulting, and I enjoy I'm looking forward to the fact that our community is going to be more active in political advocacy efforts, and I'm hoping that we will continue this engagement with our legislators and other officials at a state level, in addition to those that we deal with at local and federal levels as well. So thank you all for taking the time to participate. Diving into our panel discussion. For the audience's benefit, we're going to focus on the panel discussion on these themes. It's going to be education, healthcare, redistricting, COVID relief, primarily, and then we might have some time to dive into a few more topics. So on our first question, I'll first direct this to Representative Talarico. Can you briefly speak to some of the ongoing and future impacts of House Bill 3? Maybe just pick one or two of the top items that you might want to refer to and how it applies, and also how it applies or doesn't apply in the context of districts of innovation, and how those districts can exclude themselves from certain parts of the Texas Education Code, and also how are we and how will we provide funding for several of these initiatives that are included in the HB3. Over to you, Representative Talarico.
Yeah, first, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with your community, and so glad that y'all are putting this together. As already been mentioned, this election is most important in our lifetimes. And so thankful that y'all are getting involved at a local level. So before I was a politician, I was a middle school teacher. I taught in one of the poorest neighborhoods in our state. And I had students who were 11 and 12 years old who couldn't read and who couldn't write. And I decided to devote my life to helping to right that wrong and ensure that every child in our state has access to a high quality public education. And so I was thankful when I got elected that I got appointed to the House Public Education Committee. And then I got to work with the 12 other members of that committee to craft House Bill 3, which for those that aren't super knowledgeable about the ins and outs of the legislature, House Bill 3 was historic, transformative school finance reform that invested almost $12 billion in new funding into our system, gave almost every teacher in our community a long overdue pay raise, and for the first time in Texas history, provided full day pre-kindergarten for the kids who need it most. Now, it was a giant leap forward for our system, but it was by no means perfect. There were lots of flaws in the bill that I and the other legislators on this call pointed out and tried to fix. One, I think you alluded to in your question, which is that there was no sustainable revenue source to ensure that we keep this promise that we made to our teachers, to our families, and to our kids. So we basically paid for HB3 off of a budget surplus when we were in good economic times. And some of us warned that those good economic times wouldn't last forever. And sure enough, they didn't. And as we hit this pandemic, and as our federal and state government were unable to address the public health crisis, we now find ourselves in a deficit, in a budget shortfall. And so many of us are concerned that we're not going to be able to sustain the investments that were made through House Bill 3.
Thank you, Representative Talarico. Any of the other representatives, if you want to chime in quickly with your additional comments on that topic?
Well, let me real quickly just say that absolutely with everything that Representative Talarico said, the concern about funding it is really important. I think there's a strong sentiment among legislators to make sure that we don't go backwards. It took us a lot of bipartisan work to get to where we are, where we put an additional $6 billion in public education, an additional $5 billion of that into a property tax relief package. So, we've got to be willing to go back and look at revenue options. Everything should not be off the table. We have a lot of options here that we could move forward and not go back on our promise. And I think it's extremely important that we are held accountable to not going back on that promise.
I fully agree with both of them and what they just said. And I think our challenge next session is living up to that long long-term commitment in the budget crisis. I think about an old Joe Biden quote where he said, "Don't tell me what your values are, show me your budget, and then I'll tell you what your values are." Texas has the resources, even in a challenging year, to still take care of our children through public education. We just have to make sure it's a priority and put the money behind it. We can get it done, and I know Donna Howard knows the budget in and out, so we're gonna look to her lead to find those numbers. But we can get it done, and we'll have everyone's back as we fight for our school children.
And I just want to point out one quick thing too. So Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick had said all of these school districts across the state have reserve funds that they might have to dip into, but he failed to mention that the state has a reserve fund, the Economic Stabilization Fund, that we may have to dip into. And Republicans are so against ever using that money, but this is a time when it is needed to make sure that we're not cutting really vital, important services.
Thank you all. And then moving on to the next follow-up question, which is also on education. This would be Representative Goodwin, first to you. What efforts can be undertaken at the state legislature level to encourage curriculum content that is more inclusive and reflective of the diversity of the U.S., including its culture, its history, and achievements, and as well as perhaps also reflective of the diversity of the rest of the world, but perhaps first and foremost, the U.S. itself? Representative Goodwin?
Well, there's two things there. The State Board of Education has a big impact in what goes into our curriculum. So while you have us on a panel here tonight, I implore y'all to get to know who's running for the State Board of Education, because that's a really important race too. Also, I had a panel discussion just the other night on anti-racism and invited the AISD equity officer to speak with us. And so I think a school district employing an equity officer and having an equity office is helpful, because then they're going to be looking for that curriculum that will be more inclusive. So I think if we can get more school districts to think about more inclusion into their curriculum, but really that's mostly up to the State Board of Education.
Any of the others, folks?
Well, I would just echo with what Representative Goodwin said about making sure you know who your State Board of Education candidates are. We have two different seats that are represented in the Central Texas area, and actually going beyond that, there may even be three. But in the Austin area, for sure, there's two, and it is absolutely critical. There are 15 members on that state board. They represent twice the size of a congressional district. And so they have a huge area to cover. They don't have usually the kind of financial support to do that. They're not the kind of race that people pay attention to, but they have a huge impact on the curriculum, and they are extremely important. So I hope that you will check out who is running in the districts that are in our area, and make sure you vote for somebody who you think is going to be allowing us to have good curriculum that focuses on the diversity of our state.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is, I plan next session to work on an initiative to promote ethnic studies in our public schools, to make sure that we're celebrating our diversity, but we're ensuring that every student in a Texas public school feels empowered to be themselves and to be able to express themselves in an educational environment. And lastly, I think, moving forward, we need to really teach our students the values of a liberal democracy, including the protection of minority rights and appreciation for diversity. And so in my first term, I authored a comprehensive civics bill that passed through the House, and unfortunately died in Dan Patrick's Senate, but I plan on going back and trying to ensure that we have every child in Texas exposed to a high quality civics education.
Okay, and let me get to the next question, which is Representative Bucy. Thank you for folks on the education topic. This is redistricting. So
before you go there, do you want to mention the feedback
Sure.
from the polls?
Okay, so thank you for bringing that up. We did check with the community on their viewpoints on education, what is most important to them. And so folks, thank you for responding. Looks like we have several things that are important to them. Looks like curriculum diversity and inclusion is the most important. But close right behind that is quality of teachers and school safety and security. And then I guess the last one out of those four is state of facilities. So thank you folks for your input to that, and hopefully the representatives can use this input in their thought process as they come up with good policies on this topic on education. Moving forward to our next topic, which is redistricting. Representative Bucy, this question is first for you. Redistricting or gerrymandering is increasingly recognized as a problem in the effective functioning of the electoral system here in Texas, but also in other U.S. states. What ideas do you have that, in terms of how you can address this concern if your party does get the majority in the Texas House, or even if it doesn't get the majority? Well, how would you guys look at improving the situation?
Well, I think in the long term, we should take this job out of the hands of the politicians. And I know Representative Howard has filed legislation for many sessions to try to make this, we make our own maps. The Texas legislature makes the maps and for ourselves and for Congress, and that's an unacceptable way of doing it. So we hear all the time people talking about the voters should pick, we shouldn't pick our voters. And that's what redistricting has come down to, this gerrymandering system. I know that myself and our caucus has supported outside neutral bodies doing scientific work to make these maps equitable and fair. And unfortunately, that legislation has never been passed. Dan Patrick, the Republican Party, has never allowed that. I don't know if Rep. Howard has ever even been able to get a hearing on legislation like that. I'm sure she can speak up on that. We've got to get that done. Now the window for the next round has passed. So we're going to have to make sure when we go to the ballot box to vote for people that are committed to making fair maps. And that's what you're going to find in the House Democratic Caucus, is a bunch of individuals that understand that we want maps that represent the people of Texas, not where the politicians pick them. So I think at this point, you're going to have to know that the Republican Party has done this unfairly for many decades, and it's time to change. And then you've got to hold the Democratic Caucus accountable in the majority to getting this law changed. It shouldn't be us doing it, but that's a long-term game at this point now, because that window has come and gone, and we've got to do our maps next session. So it is going to be the politicians. Now, I know our caucus will rely on experts and bring in outside support to try to make these maps as equitable as we can. And that's what needs to be done. I think you just look at our congressional races here throughout Austin and the way that they've sliced and diced Austin up to try to weaken a community voice from Austin. It's just unacceptable. Even in my part, House District 31, so US 31, it's Williamson and Bell, and a lot of people think that makes sense. But if you look closer in Bell County, they cut out the minority part of that district up in the Bell County of this district. And if that hadn't happened, MJ Hagar would be our congresswoman right now. And so this has ripple effects. It goes to show that true representation isn't happening. And so I know that philosophically I'm committed to that fight, and I'm going to try to make sure when we make our maps, it's based on equity. And then I'm committed to Donna Howard's ongoing, I think, decades-long fight to get this out of the hands of the politicians here in Texas. I'm sure she has more to say on that issue.
Thank you, Representative Bucy. Representative Howard, would you like to add anything to it, or any of the others?
Sure. I mean, I thank you, John, for how you described all of that. We must get away from the current politicized way of drawing lines. We're not going to take politics all the way out of it, but it's got to be done in a way that people have confidence that the lines are being drawn to represent communities of interest, to keep people together, to vote for fair representation, as opposed to drawing the lines to help incumbents or particular parties. There's no reason that we shouldn't be able to move beyond this. We did have a hearing this time. A couple of different redistricting bills were presented, but the committee never took a vote and never had another meeting. So it never went anywhere. It was just an opportunity to have the hearing, which was at least a start. But we're getting, kind of late in the game here. What we can do in time to be able to impact what happens with redistricting is going to be a challenge with us waiting till the last minute like this. We are going to be delayed probably with redistricting. There's concerns about how we're going to have community input, public input into this process with the limits that are placed on how we're going to be meeting and the lack of traveling around the state, which was the plan for this interim. That didn't happen. So, I think that for me personally, when I hear Republicans in particular talking about ballot fraud and voter fraud, To me, gerrymandering is basically virtually stuffing the ballot box. You are drawing lines to get the right ballots in that box to elect a particular person. To me, that's the fraud.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to add to that? If not, we'll go to the next topic, which is to Representative. Well, I'm sorry, we have some poll results to share on that topic. So let's just review that first. Voter awareness looks like the most important topic to the community. Polling booth safety, and I'm assuming that's people are answering that in the context of COVID right now in terms of how personal safety is impacted, is the second most important topic. And then ease of voter registration, voter ID restrictions fall behind that. But there's also some concern on language issues as well, and the support for that. So thank you, community, for sharing that. And
can I jump in on that poll results just real quick, just because I want to talk on voting rights access real quick. One, we need everyone to push through and vote, whatever the safest way for you to do that is. We have to show up. We can't let the intimidation factors of the president or the governor or the changing of how we're voting from day in and day out be an intimidation. And that's what they're trying to do, is intimidate us from getting out. So whether that's voting safely by mail, which we should all have the right to do, but unfortunately that's not the way it's been written in law, or if it's putting on your mask and voting early, we need to do our part to make sure, one, our voice is heard and we're not intimidated. I look at, polling booth safety, and you're right, that's somewhat probably around COVID, but I think it's also tied to Donald Trump asking people to go be poll watchers, when what he's really saying is asking his supporters to go intimidate people that don't share his values, to try to scare them from the ballot box. We can't give in to that. Now, as far as ease of voter registration, our colleague Rep. Israel has been fighting for online voter registration. We're one of the few states that don't allow it. Online voter registration is more accurate, it's more secure, and it's cheaper. It's something that makes total sense, even from a conservative perspective. But because it would make it easier for more people to vote, we've seen opposition in this state. But we've got to get louder about that. And I look at voter ID restrictions. One, you shouldn't have to have an ID to vote as a citizen. And two, look at the IDs they allow. They don't allow your college student ID. So these are issues that we're going to continue to keep at the forefront and fight for. But I just want to make sure we touch on those, looking at these poll results, that we are aware of these concerns, and the Democratic caucus is fighting hard for these every day.
Thank you. I just would request you guys, I'll let you get in, Representative Goodwin, but just please keep your answers a little bit more briefer so we can try to get through a little bit more content. So Representative Goodwin, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, on the information, voter awareness, I just wanted to point out two places where people can get information. One is votetravis.com, where you can find out how long the lines are at voting locations. That might help with the safety issue, particularly if you want to stay distanced. You can see if the green light means that there's not a line. So votetravis.com. And then for information about candidates and issues that are going to be on the ballot, vote411.org is great. It's the League of Women Voters, and you get to see both candidates side by side, or all three, or however many are running, side by side with their answers to the same questions. So it's really good information.
Thank you. Representative Howard, the next question is for you. Healthcare. Can you briefly speak to how we can expand healthcare coverage to more Texans, and how we can also keep it affordable? Should we look at expanding Medicaid? What other proposals do you support?
Let me just say about votetravis.com that as somebody who did a mail-in ballot and is concerned about it being received and counted, that will also track it for you. So you'll know when they have sent it to you and when they receive it. So just wanted to give a plug to that too. Healthcare, huge issue. One of the biggest parts of our budget. And yes, we need to expand Medicaid. And Representative Bucy had an amendment to our budget last time that would have allowed us to work toward that. It was not, it was a party line division on that. But the fact is that these are our federal dollars that we are sending to Washington in terms of our income tax that are not coming back to help Texans. We're one of, I think, 12 states now that has not expanded. We would be getting approximately $10 billion a year of our federal money coming back to help Texas, a 9-to-1 match. Yes, there would have to be some state outlay to do that, but most all of the other states that have expanded, which include a lot of Republican states, have found that it has not impacted their other programs. There are ways to make this work. And the fact is, right now, we have pushed the costs onto our local communities. It's quite possible that we could work something out to reduce property taxes if we can shift the cost back to the Medicaid program by expanding it. We're also looking at the serious problem we have in our state of maternal morbidity and mortality. And right now, you can only get Medicaid coverage as an adult woman if you are, well, you have to be either a senior, disabled, or pregnant. So once a woman finds out she's pregnant, she can get on Medicaid through that pregnancy. 2 months after she delivers, she's kicked off the program. We know that a large portion of the mortalities that occur postpartum occur within that first year. So we want to at least expand Medicaid coverage for 12 months postpartum. There's a lot of other things we need to look at here, but let me just point out with COVID. Before COVID, approximately 18% of Texans were not insured. Since COVID, it's jumped up to something like 29%. We have got to figure out a way to deliver health care. We've got to make sure that Texans have what they need in order to be able to be productive with their home life, their families, their jobs, their schools, their community. You can't do this if you have 29% of your folks that can't even access health care. So yes, there's a lot we need to do here, and I'm sure my colleagues have some more to say about that, but this is going to be one of the things that as the chairperson of the Women's Health Caucus, I'm going to be focused on, particularly in terms of women's health and family health.
Representative Howard, the other folks, would you like to quickly chime in briefly, please?
Yeah. Rep Goodwin, where are you going?
No, you go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to add, I saw in one of your earlier polls that healthcare costs was one of the concerns. Medicaid expansion now, after in post-pandemic world, means 2.2 million more Texans getting healthcare coverage. And even if that's not you, if you already have health insurance, this matters to all of us because it will help lower all of our premiums. It also helps lower our county taxes that right now deal with emergency care service for the uninsured at the highest rate. So the more people have coverage, the more it's going to pay an impact across all of us. And so I think that's really important to remember. It's also an amazing jobs creator to expand Medicaid. So it's even though we have a 10% buy-in, it's going to ultimately have such an economic payoff for our state through extra healthcare coverage, through the jobs. And it has an impact that you can get these data, not just for statewide, you can look down to your local county and see how it's going to make a major impact. And Travis and Williamson would benefit greatly. It's something we need to get done. You already pay the taxes, so let's bring those tax dollars home to help Texans.
Thank you, Representative Bucy. Representative Goodwin, did you want to quickly add something to that?
No, I think they covered it.
Thank you. And then on the survey on this, we can see that cost of healthcare is clearly the leading concern among the community. So that's definitely their first priority. Behind that, you got sort of equally quality of care, insurance coverage, and ease of access to care. Those sort of the concerns that our community has on that topic. Moving on to our next topic, this would be in the context of jobs and COVID relief. Representative Talarico first. Over the last several years, Texas has generally had a strong and growing economy compared to many of the states. However, the last 6-7 months have brought a lot of economic hardships to Texas and to Texans and to other states as well. Many jobs have been affected. Can you briefly speak to how we can help Texans on this in the short term over the next several months while continuing the delicate balance between safety and restarting our economy?
Yeah, to craft an effective plan, we first have to diagnose the problem correctly. And we're not going to be able to recover from this economic collapse until we adequately address the public health crisis. You know, Governor Abbott said as much in the beginning days of this pandemic. He said, until we get COVID under control, we're never going to get our economy back up and running. I think he forgot his own advice when he started opening up bars and restaurants before experts said that it was safe. And we saw Texas slip back in terms of our progress on COVID. We saw cases spike, we saw deaths rise. And because of that, our economy has continued to slow. And we've seen more than 5 million Texans file for unemployment benefits. And so, you know, until we're able to have an adequate public health response at the federal level and the state level, we're never going to have our economy get back on its feet. The last thing I'll just briefly mention is we should ask ourselves why so many of our fellow Texans were living paycheck to paycheck. Why do so many of our Texans not have adequate savings in the bank? And that's because our economy benefits those who are wealthy and those who are well connected, and it doesn't benefit working class and middle class families.
Thank you. Any of the others want to add in from a short-term perspective? The next question will be long-term, though.
Okay, I just will quickly say I was on the Chamber of Commerce's reopening task force, and what I think was clear to all of us as we're trying to move forward here is, one, we don't have the data we need that's consistent and credible and reliable to make good decisions. We've got to be basing this on metrics. We've got to be basing this on science. And I think Austin has done a pretty good job using the UT consortium that they have in place that's been doing some modeling with some real-time data on hospitalizations and so forth. So I think that's what we really have to focus on. But also the other thing is that what was revealed across all industries is the problem we have with having affordable, accessible childcare. We knew that before COVID, but it's now something that we're all very keenly aware of, and how that is an economic factor, being able to have childcare. Then the other one was the broadband accessibility. And one of the things that came out by industry doing some mapping in our area is that Austin, actually, the Travis County area, is about 98% connected. It's not as much the accessibility as it is the adoption. And the adoption is impacted, of course, by things like not having sufficient resources to pay for it, and also not having the knowledge itself about how you would do these things and how important it is in the family. But there are so many things we need to be working on that are going to be an important part of getting our economy going again. There's no question about it. This is not going to happen overnight, but we are seeing movements forward. We can open safely, but it requires that we have the necessary investments in testing and tracing, and we have good data and all those things that allow us to monitor as we try to reopen. That's been something that unfortunately the state has not does not have a good track record for.
Thank you, Representative Howard. Briefly, I'll just talk about the survey that from our community perspective, in terms of jobs coming back, they're looking at gender inequality in terms of, or I guess how we will maintain equality when the jobs, in terms of jobs and how they come back, COVID relief. So I guess gender inequality is perhaps a broader concern. COVID relief and how we manage that, general unemployment and minimum wage are sort of other topics that people are concerned about from a job perspective. This kind of tails into our next question, and we'll go to Representative Bucy and Representative Goodwin for that one. If you can quickly share your thoughts on, from a longer term perspective, as we're recovering from this, what are ways in which we can ensure equity across our recovery efforts in terms of how people are getting the assistance to those who are most impacted by it, and I'll just leave it at that. So Representative Bucy.
Sure. I mean, one thing we have to do is just, how we can protect equity as we get out the assistance. I mean, I think what we have to do then is look at the communities that have been hit the hardest. We know that communities of color have been hit the hardest by COVID-19, making sure that when we look at jobs and recovery and schools, that those areas are not being neglected as so often happens. So I think that is one priority. We know that what COVID-19 has really done is it's exacerbated the difference between the haves and the have-nots in the state. I think we've seen it when it's come to connectivity, internet, broadband, for our students having to learn remotely. Families with resources have, I don't want to say anyone's excelled in COVID, but the challenges have been lesser for those with families with resources, families that come from higher education. We've seen that people on the front lines getting the sickest are the ones working in our restaurant industry or in our blue collar jobs, which tends to hit, lower income, and also our communities of color higher. So I think our recovery has to look to that need and make sure long-term that we're taking care of that. I see on here, part of the study talks about minimum wage. Texas has to do more. We could lead on this, but we haven't. We're always behind and having to follow the state. I think getting that done is essential. Making sure that healthcare coverage for everyone is an essential part of this when you think about those having to be on the front lines. And so often it being lower wage jobs, it's also individuals that don't have the healthcare coverage. I think about our...
Thank you, Representative Bucy.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. And Representative Goodwin, did you want to quickly add anything on that, on the longer term? And then we'll sort of...
Yeah, I mean, last session I filed a bill that would have raised the minimum wage, and I think that's really important. Raising the minimum wage will raise everybody's wages. We need even the minimum wage isn't a living wage. And one of the things that we saw with the CARES Act was that distribution of money, the money that went directly to people into their pockets so that they can continue to pay rent and buy groceries and all those things. That had an impact on our economy. That kept us from falling into this recession early on. But now people are beginning to struggle because those payments have stopped. And the CARES money hasn't all been distributed. We definitely need to make sure the governor has a plan to distribute all the money coming from the federal government to help the people of Texas.
Got it. We're trying to wrap up the panel discussion. This is one last question. You can probably just do a sudden death, very quick answer from all four of you guys. This would be on environment and climate change. Can you speak to maybe one or two ideas, you don't have to give details, that you would want to pursue on the environment and climate change, or preservation of environment and climate change, over the next year or in the next legislative session? We can start with Representative Goodwin. You can go first.
Sure. So fires and flaring. So within my district, Steiner Ranch had a really serious fire a few years back. And so we need to make sure that we do everything we can to mitigate or prevent fires, actually. So that's something that my office is working on. We've talked to the county to see what the best solution is. Somebody had an outdoor burn in the Long Canyon neighborhood recently in June. And there was a lot of concern about how easy it was for them to get a permit to do that. And so we're talking to ESDs to find out how we can make that a better permitting process. And then the flaring, right now it's illegal for the oil and gas companies to vent and flare gas, but they get exemptions. Like tens of thousands of exemptions have been given in the last couple of years. And we shouldn't be doing that.
Great, thank you. Quickly, Representative Talarico, next. I want to try to wrap up this panel discussion, please. Quickly.
Yeah, I think the single best thing we could do at this point, especially if we have a Republican-controlled legislature or a partially Republican-controlled legislature, is to, at the very least, get a climate action plan put in place for our state. As you all know, we've experienced 500-year floods just in the past few years. We've seen historic wildfires, historic droughts, and increasing temperatures. And so if we want to protect Texas from climate change, we've got to put a plan in place now.
Representative Bucy?
Yeah, this is the most clear and present threat, but so often falls off the front burner when we're looking at day to day. What we can do in Texas, just to add on to the list, is there used to be a program to help get cars that were old or pollutant either updated or off the road and help people make the transition. That funding budget has been taken away. I think that needs to be restored. I think that's just an everyday thing that we could be doing to help Texans, play a small part in keeping the environment more clean.
Thank you. Representative Howard?
Well, I think I would basically approach this from my role on appropriations and the program that Representative Bucy just talked about, the LIRAP program. We need to get things like that back in place. We need to be using our TERP funds to actually use them to impact in a positive way what's going on in the community. There's a lot of things that we can do in terms of making sure we have the appropriations that allow the communities to put in place a lot of things that are already there or have been there so that we can actually address this.
Thank you all. Appreciate your time in this panel discussion. Thank you for the community for participating in that. I'm going to hand over to Sana to conduct the community Q&A portion of the segment. Appreciate your time. One last message that I'd like to pass on is I want to point out to the community, we've made several events that we've been doing. We want to emphasize that we want to really appreciate the reps for joining. These are legislators or the other guests were candidates. These folks have dual roles. They have legislators and existing lawmakers who have experience, and they're also, of course, running for re-election. So please, for the community, maintain this contact at the state level with your legislators. It's very important. They are very impactful for us. Sana, over to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Farouk. Really appreciate that. And thank you again to our representatives for joining us today. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sana Megani, and I'll be moderating the community Q&A. First, can I just say how excited I am to see so many Pakistani Americans here? Can we just quickly do a virtual high five and applause? It is amazing. In a time where we are away from our mosque, away from our communities, away from our families, Zoom has brought us together, and it is so heartwarming to see so many of you here today. I really appreciate that. See younger members of our community, older members of our community, everyone in between. Thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for making sure that our voices are heard. And so with that, I'll start the community Q&A. We don't have too much time left. But I'll start with a question that has been close to my heart as a new mom. And Representative Howard, I'll start with you. And you mentioned this, in your remarks earlier, but maternal mortality rate for women of color in Texas is higher than for white women. In fact, Black women are twice as likely to die from pregnancy-related deaths as white women. What do you plan to do to ensure that women of color receive the same care that they need and deserve during pregnancy and in the postpartum phase?
Thank you. I'll try to be very quick, but as you point out, it affects that issue. It affects COVID. It affects the re-employment. The Bureau of Labor Statistics it showed that whites, their jobs are increasing. People of color staying the same. It permeates all segments of our community, but in particular with healthcare, we clearly wanted to extend the coverage for the 12 months postpartum for sure. That's one of the things that we wanted to do. But in terms of addressing specifically people of color, women of color, we had an Office of Minority Health. It has had several different names. It was defunded in 2017. Its goal was specifically to look at disproportionality and disparities. At the very time we were been grappling with this particular issue of maternal morbidity and mortality, that office has gone away. We are going to work to restore that office during this next session. It has a huge role to play in how we move forward and ensure that we are not shortchanging women who are going to be moms. These are people we say we revere, and yet we have not, for some reason, with the institutional racism or whatever the biases are here, have not been given the same kind of care.
I really appreciate that. Any of the other representatives want to add on quickly before I move over to our next question from our community members?
Sana, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Sorry. I'm back. So what options, our next question is what options are there for Democrat House representatives to influence redistricting if Republicans are still in the majority? And I will give that over to you, Representative Bucy.
We need to not be in the majority. I mean, we need to make sure they're not still in the majority. I think what happens between now and Election Day matters. What we're going to need if we don't take the majority, we're going to need the community help. We're going to need to make sure the community is present, talking to your elected officials in whatever capacity that being present means during session in the pandemic. We're going to need it. Being in people's face in a professional and polite way, but talking to the elected officials and letting them know the way you feel and what matters has an influence on all of us. I think if we're in the majority in the House, we still won't have the Senate. We won't have the governor. So then we're going to have to be tough. And one thing we can do is make some agreements based on the budget if we're going to hold that until we get our equitable and fair maps drawn. There's a lot of ways if we get the majority that we can have more influence. That's why this election is so important at the state level. It's, as y'all talked about at the top, what happens at the federal level matters. This matters, and it will have an impact for the next decade. So this is what's on the ballot. It's one of the major things on the ballot this time. So we got to get out and vote.
Thank you. Any of the other representatives want to add to that?
I agree.
Thank you. Our next question is with respect to gun control and violence. We'd like to hear from each of the representatives very briefly, what are your views and what are your thoughts about making sure that our community stays safe? And particularly, as I think there are many of us who have school-age children here, making sure that our kids are safe in their schools.
Okay, I'll start.
I can jump in.
Okay, start.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I had legislation this last session on safe storage of guns, partially as a result of a statewide task force that looks at child fatalities. And it was one of their primary recommendations because of all the young children that accidentally get access a gun that should have been properly stored. It also is something that's been supported by suicide prevention groups, as it's been demonstrated that ready access to a firearm that's not properly secured increases completions of suicide. And then finally, the thefts. A huge number of guns are stolen, especially from cars, when they're not properly stored, resulting in homicides and violent crimes. So Representative Goodwin helped me on this particular piece of legislation. We got a hearing, we never got a vote, but I was able, by being on appropriations, to get $1 million into the budget for the Department of Public Safety to come up with a public safety, a PSA that would be looking at how do we address this on a statewide level. They've just rolled it out. It's called Keep 'Em Safe Texas. We'll see how it goes, but there's a lot we need to be doing in this area. The whole point is about responsible gun ownership and safety, so that we don't have the unnecessary deaths that are occurring as a result of something like unsafe storage.
Thank you, Representative Howard. Representative Talarico, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think there's a non-intuitive answer to this question that folks who aren't at the legislature may not be aware of, and that is campaign finance reform. There's a broad coalition of Texans on both sides of the political aisle who support things like universal background checks, closing the gun show loophole, banning high-capacity magazines, but we can't get it done because the NRA and the gun lobby exert so much influence over our political process, in particular, our political campaigns. And so until we're ready to get that under control and tackle the problem of campaign finance, we're really not going to make progress on issues like gun safety and a lot of other issues that there is broad support in the public for. The last thing I'll say is I was a teacher in the classroom when the Sandy Hook shooting occurred. And so this is very personal to me. And our number one job as adults is to protect children. And right now we're failing to do that. Our Republican colleagues think that the solution to school gun violence is to put up more metal detectors and to arm our teachers with guns. My colleagues on this call and I have pushed for gun safety measures and also more mental health support in our schools to ensure that we are identifying problems before they become tragedies.
Representative Goodwin, I'll have you go next.
I would say universal background checks are just really important. And what we need to do is remind everybody that after the El Paso shootings, even Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick was in favor at that point in time of universal background checks. And so oftentimes people will say things right after a tragedy, and then we get to session and they change their position, but we need to remind them of why it's so important.
Yeah, and to that point, that's where you all come into play. Dan Patrick said he'd be for red flag laws after the shootings in West Texas. Well, let's hold him accountable to it when we're actually back in session. I think they say that then when we all asked for a special session to act on it, then they didn't help us do that because they knew with time the pressure to get it done from the community would go away. But I will add, when we talk about school safety, I think Rep. Talarico hits it on the head when it's not what we always think, but we need more counselors in our school that can help with preventative ahead of the time. The ratio of counselor to student is unacceptable in the state, and this is something the legislature could do. It takes more money, but it's finding those resources to help our school districts have a better, counselor to student ratio. And I think that is a really important part to this equation. It's something I've spent a lot of the interim meeting about how we can try to find that resource for our schools.
Great, thank you so much. And if you have questions, keep them coming. If you have a question specifically for a representative, make sure you mention that in the chat and we'll do our best to get it answered. We just have a few more minutes here. So I'll start with my next question. We'll start with you, Rep. Bucy. The question is, what are some strategies we can employ to begin to bridge the gap or division that has been created between the two parties and the supporters of each? How do we bring our communities together and do really community over party or country over party?
Sure. I think Williamson County is showing a good example of that. And this may sound counterintuitive, but the first thing we had to do was get at the table. I think for so long it was a one-party county, even though it wasn't a one-party electorate. It's just the Democrats weren't organized and they weren't having a seat at the table. As we bring races closer together, and we have to compete on the November ballot and not in the primary ballot, I think it forces us to find more compromise. I think that's how we got in part House Bill 3 done last time. It's a public education bill. It's one of the best bills we've seen in 30 years for public schools. And it was 149 of the 150 members that voted for it. When 12 Democrats were elected that flipped seats and the body was so much more to an even split, I think we find compromise. So it's having a two-party system, being engaged. It's going to be hard to see that when we're this close to election day, but I promise you come November 4th or when we get back in the building in January, there will be bipartisan conversations. So the 1,200 bills we voted on last time, a few make the press for being divided by partisanship. Most of the bills we voted on had bipartisan support.
Representative Goodwin, over to you.
Redistricting is so important on this issue. You know, like John Bucy was saying, if our districts are more balanced between Republicans and Democrats, that forces the representatives to get out in their districts and have conversations with the people in their districts. We see so often, particularly at the congressional level, that they won't even meet with their constituents. They're afraid to, and they don't have to when their district is so heavily one side or the other. So redistricting is really important here.
Representative Talarico.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that politicians in a democracy are just acting on the incentives that are kind of inherent in the system. So it's less to me and my experience so far, it's less about how do individual actors, on the House floor work with each other or how they talk about each other. Really, they're just responding to what their voters want. And currently in Texas, the way to keep your seat in a gerrymandered system is to win your primary. And so for most districts that are deeply red, you just got to win your primary to keep your seat. In districts that are deeply blue, you've got to win your Democratic primary to keep your seat. And so those incentives are there to push you toward the farthest flank of your party. And until we fix that flaw in the system, we're not going to see individual politicians act differently. And the last thing I think we should also consider is our media environment, particularly social media, which these companies out in the Bay Area have designed these platforms that were originally intended for genuine connection, but have actually created more conflict. And that is part of their business model, because more conflict leads to more clicks, which makes more profit for them. So until we get these big tech companies under control and start regulating their platforms, I think we're going to continue to see voters living within these echo chambers, and that's going to again lead to more polarization and partisanship in the electoral side.
Finally, Representative Howard.
Oh, I've served in the House when it was 76-74 and when it was 101-49. So I've seen two really different types of houses. Certainly there were more coalitions that were able to be built when we were more evenly divided. We had to work together. But I also think it's important, and what feeds into it maybe indirectly, but I still think it's important, is who we elect to serve. And right now we have a part-time legislature in Texas that meets for 5 months every other year. And then supposedly, except with COVID, meets for a lot of interim hearings and so forth. Who can do that? Only people who have the means to do that. The vast majority of our representation at the Capitol is older, it's white, and it's male. And until we reflect the diversity and the demographics of those that we serve and represent, I think we're going to have a hard time bringing everybody together. Once we do that, I think we're going to see that we have a lot more opportunities to work together because we'll actually reflect our communities.
I especially love that, Representative Howard. I'll speak, I statement. I particularly love when I can see, and even for my daughter, women that are representing us, people of color that are representing us, and it feels like we have the opportunity to also be in those elected seats because we see people that look like us.
Exactly.
It's been a great conversation today. I really enjoyed this. And before I hand it over to kind of wrap up here, I have one last question, just in 15 seconds or less. We've had the opportunity to have you here with our community, and it's been great to have you. But what would you like to end with? Anything that you'd like to share with the Pakistani-American community here? We're just a few days away from early voting. What do you want us to know before we head to the polls?
I'll go first. And it's kind of what I said earlier. We all have to vote. We can't let the intimidation or the pandemic or anything else keep us from this most important right of ours, and that's to get out and cast a ballot. And it's not just the top of the ticket, and that's kind of the point of this conversation. The ballot, all the candidates up and down the ballot, the local level makes such a difference. And I'm not just talking about our level, even lower than us. So knowing your ballot, being prepared, having a plan to go vote, and then going out on acting on that, we've got to get it done. It's so vital to making sure we build a better country, a better state, and better community moving forward. So this election is so important. So please make sure you go vote and make sure your neighbors and friends vote.
Great, thanks, Rep. Bucy. How about Rep. Talarico?
Yeah, I know we have a lot of our Muslim brothers and sisters here on this call. This president likes to talk about religious freedom when he's on the campaign trail, but I think that applies to anyone who's not Muslim, because he started out his presidency with a ban on Muslims entering our country. And we have to remember that he is a threat to your community, which means he's a threat to all of us. And Barbara Jordan, great Texan, had a saying that I love, that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so I just want to thank all of you for being at the table.
I love that. Thank you so much for saying that. Representative Howard.
Oh, well, I take that further from Shirley Chisholm. If you're not at the table, then you bring your own chair. And that's what we're trying to do here right now, especially women in the House. But the main thing I would say is vote. Every vote counts. For those that don't know this or don't remember, in 2010, I won my election ultimately by four votes out of over 50,000 cast. So do not think that your vote doesn't matter. It can be the ultimate decider in some elections. Please vote.
Love that. We're here in our virtual Zoom seats. We're ready. We're ready to vote, and we're ready to get our voices heard. And finally, to wrap us up, Representative Goodwin.
All right. Well, I would say just remember there's always hope. The other night when I had my panel discussion on racism, hearing some of the stories of the challenges that were going on within the communities of color, I really started to feel very concerned. And I asked each of my panelists, do you feel hopeful? And they all did. So I just, there's always hope for a better Texas, for a better United States, and keep up the hope and go vote.
Thank you so much. I definitely have all the feels right now. I'm sensing from the nods and smiles, you all do too. So I'm going to hand it over back to Mina to wrap us up. Thank you so much for having me here as your moderator. And if we missed your question, I apologize, but we had so much time, so I really appreciate it. Over to you, Mina.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you guys. This was exactly the engagement we were hoping for. Candid conversation, discussions that were honest. We really saw the passion that's there amongst you as you seek this reelection. I would say that Representative Goodwin, you took the words out of my mouth. We also saw hope for the future. We see in you four this drive to want to work for communities of inclusion. And so the future does burn bright for our kids tonight as a result. So what does the future look like for PACT? Briefly, we just want to share with you what we've been up to. A big thanks to all of you in the community who participated in our first ever phone bank last week. It was awesome. Tomorrow, we're doing our second phone bank. We'll be making phone calls on behalf of Teen PACT to remind people to vote. So if you're interested, 1 to 2:30 tomorrow, please fill out a Google form in the chat window that we're going to be putting up, or simply email Myrene Mullick at myrenemullick@gmail.com. Moving on, get out the vote. Vote, vote, vote. We cannot stress that enough. In our in minds, the number one take-home message here is engagement. And so here are a few resources: votetexas.gov, Vote 411, and just a few deadlines to remind you about early voting, when it ends, and then election day. And finally, we just want to reiterate that this is not a me process. This is a we process. We cannot stress enough the possibilities and the power that we have in our hand if we band together as a community. So please do your part and pick the part that suits you the best, whether it's political contributions for our people that you believe in, community participation, support your community, help us go out there together through PACT and take care of our community and volunteer and really just help raise political awareness as a whole. We at PACT thank you all for staying engaged, and to all 4 of our state representatives, thank you once again. And on behalf of PACT, I bid everybody a good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Anjum, you cracked me up.
We still have some participants on the call.
I'm just wrapping that up, so I think we're